Every generation believes it has already grasped most of the past, that history has been measured, classified, and arranged into a reasonable order, that whatever remains is only detail lying still beneath the ground, waiting to be footnoted. But there are years when the past refuses to follow that script. It surfaces where no one thought to look, in ice retreating faster than science can keep up, beneath forests once called untouched by human feet, and at the bottom of the sea, where the map of history was never drawn. These discoveries do not answer our questions. They make the old questions no longer sufficient. If what has just been seen is accurate, then history does not move in a straight line, and humanity may not have begun where we have long assumed it did. For many decades, archaeology functioned as a science of patience. It meant removing the earth layer by thin layer, recording the smallest details, and accepting that most of the past would forever remain out of reach. Gaps in history were not treated as failures, but as something natural. Not because humans had never existed there, but because their traces were not durable enough to survive time. By 2025, that understanding began to feel fragile, not because ancient humans suddenly appeared more advanced in modern imagination, but because the surface of the Earth no longer concealed its secrets as effectively as before. Ice melted faster than hypotheses could be built. Dense forests were no longer absolute barriers to observation from above. Regions once marked as nothing there slowly revealed straight lines, geometric patterns, structures that nature rarely produces by chance. LiDAR technology itself was not new. It had existed and been used for years. What changed by 2025 was not the tool but the scale and the speed. For the first time, vast areas could be scanned in short periods of time, with enough resolution to detect subtle changes in terrain. Changes that traditional archaeology could almost never perceive. When thousands of square kilometers were stripped bare at once, patterns began to emerge. And when those patterns repeated, calling them random became increasingly difficult. At the same time, artificial intelligence took on a different role. Not to deliver conclusions, but to point out mismatches. AI did not declare the existence of forgotten civilizations. It did something far simpler and far more unsettling. It showed that too much data no longer fit the historical models in use. Structures once assumed to be natural had a lower probability of forming than predicted. Settlement distributions considered impossible appeared in multiple, unrelated regions. Dates once dismissed as anomalies began clustering closer together than expected. Then there was another factor, one that did not come from laboratories but from the Earth itself. Permafrost thawed without waiting for science to be ready. It showed no concern for academic debate or careful procedure. What had been preserved for tens of thousands of years began to surface in fragile states, forcing researchers to react faster than their customary pace allowed. In that context, caution, long the foundation of science, became a practical pressure. What made 2025 different was not only technology or climate, but the media environment surrounding science. Raw data, partially interpreted images, and experimental models spread beyond specialist circles almost immediately. The public no longer encountered only final conclusions, but witnessed hesitation, contradiction, and uncertainty in real time. Science had never been this transparent, never this easy to misunderstand. Within that setting, a very old assumption began to be questioned, that history must move along a straight line. Linear history was not imposed arbitrarily, it arose from necessity. To remember, to teach, to connect, cause and effect, humans need order. From hunting and gathering to agriculture, from villages to cities, from stone to metal, the past was arranged into a coherent sequence, as if all of humanity had walked the same path, differing only in speed. This way of telling history is not wrong, it is effective, But that effectiveness always comes with simplification. Branching paths are blurred, abandoned choices are compressed, and what does not fit is often set aside, waiting for enough evidence or labeled as an exception. The problem does not appear when there is only one exception, it appears when exceptions begin to accumulate. In a history imagined as a straight line, every discovery that seems too early becomes uncomfortable. Not because the data are weak, but because there is no clear place to put them. An artifact outside the familiar order forces the entire narrative to adjust, bringing with it questions that science cannot answer all at once. And so, linear history became a convenient assumption. But as new data continues to surface from places once considered peripheral, from deep forests and frozen ground to the ocean floor, that assumption is beginning to reveal its limits. When history is viewed as a network rather than a straight line, regions once pushed to the edges of the map begin to shift in significance. The Amazon is one of the clearest examples. For centuries, the forest was treated as an absolute wilderness. Too vast, too wet, too chaotic for ancient humans to organize or shape in lasting ways. A place where people could exist only briefly, then withdraw, leaving behind little trace. That assumption kept the Amazon outside the historical narrative for a very long time. The discoveries of the past decade, especially the data that came into sharper focus by 2025, did not arrive as a sudden reversal. They resembled puzzle pieces that had existed for years, only now placed side by side. When the forest canopy was removed from maps using LiDAR, the surface of the Amazon appeared not as a random tangle of nature, but as a space once shaped with intention. Straight lines stretching for kilometers. Repeating geometric forms with a precision difficult to explain through ordinary geological processes. Mounds, ditches, and flattened platforms emerging in areas previously labeled simply as unexplored rainforest. No single structure on its own is enough to rewrite history, but when hundreds, then thousands of similar traces appear across an immense area, perspective begins to change. The Amazon no longer looks like an untouchable wilderness, but like a landscape shaped over long periods of time, not by a centralized empire, but by many dispersed communities, loosely connected, maintaining their presence across generations. Alongside these surface geometries came another discovery, quieter but no less significant: artificial black soils commonly known as terra preta. Unlike natural forest soils, which are typically nutrient-poor, these patches are rich in organic matter, stable for thousands of years, and show clear signs of deliberate creation. Ash, biochar, pottery fragments, and household waste combined into a regenerative soil system, a form of agricultural knowledge never written down, yet leaving traces far more durable than stone architecture. The existence of terra preta raises an unavoidable question. If ancient Amazonian societies lived only as shifting, temporary groups, why invest in soil improvement with such long-term effectiveness? These soils were not made for a single growing season. They were maintained across generations, implying social stability, knowledge transmission, and an ability to plan for the future. Qualities rarely associated with older images of deep forest tribes. From here, another way of seeing begins to take shape. The Amazon may never have been a purely wild space. It may once have been a subtly managed environment, one where humans did not impose rigid order on nature, but tuned it to biological rhythms, climate, and water flow. No massive stone cities, no permanent monuments, only soil, plants, and interventions, light enough to blend back into the landscape once people withdrew. It was precisely the absence of these loud traces that led the Amazon to be excluded from history so early. When communities disappeared, due to climate shifts, disease, or first contact with the outside world, there were no ruined cities, no exposed stone, to signal that this land had once been shaped. The forest did not need to erase anything, it simply kept growing. And as vegetation advanced quickly enough, what had once been organized became difficult to see. Within just a few centuries, a landscape deeply shaped by human hands came to be regarded as never inhabited, not because people had not been there, but because history rarely remembers what can restore itself. The Amazon was not destroyed, it was misunderstood. Within that long-standing misunderstanding, the traces that remained became out of place. Not because they were false, but because they did not fit the way history had grown accustomed to recognizing human presence. History favors large evidence, fortifications, monuments, writing, while subtle, dispersed interventions that blend into nature are often treated as if they never existed. Sometimes what disrupts the order is not scale, but position. It is there, but in the wrong place within the story we tell about the past. The so-called serpent's gaze emerges within that context. It is not a sensational discovery, nor is it large enough to rewrite the story of the Amazon, but it exists where it was not expected and carries a date that forces a pause. Not as a declaration, but as a small detail placed on the wrong page, enough to suggest that this book may have been rearranged long before we began reading it. According to initial reports, the object was found in a stable soil layer with no signs of disturbance, lying well beneath known Amazonian cultivation strata. Its form is unremarkable, a small object, smooth-surfaced, with gentle curves that evoke the eye or head of a reptile. The discomfort does not come from its shape, it comes from its material and finish. The surface shows evidence of having been shaped through controlled heat and pressure, too uniform to be accidental and too precise to be easily attributed to crude techniques. Its age quickly became the center of debate. Organic samples surrounding the object produced radiocarbon dates falling far earlier than the familiar timelines associated with known Amazonian societies, not by centuries but by millennia. Reactions split immediately. Some suggested contamination, stratigraphic disturbance, or sampling error. Others were more cautious, withholding conclusions, yet unable to ignore the fact that multiple samples from the same layer returned strikingly consistent results. Notably, the debate has not centered on whether the object is real. It has centered on how it should be understood. There have been no official claims of advanced metallurgy, no assertions of a lost industrial culture. Most researchers have actively avoided such language. Instead, they have posed narrower, more uncomfortable questions. If not metallurgy in the conventional sense, then what kind of craft could produce such a surface? If not high technology, could it represent a form of skilled knowledge that has simply been underestimated? Archaeology has repeatedly had to revise assumptions about the capabilities of ancient people. Stone constructions once deemed impossible with simple tools, agricultural systems dismissed as primitive until their sophistication became visible. But the serpent's gaze challenges from a different angle. It does not confront with scale, but with refinement. It does not suggest massive labor forces, but individual skill, traditions of making honed over long periods of time. What makes this object unsettling may not be its age, but its strange familiarity. It does not feel like something from a distant, alien future. It feels like something made by someone who understood their material intimately, how it responds to heat, to force, to time. An understanding that required no theory or writing, but accumulated through repeated practice across generations. From here, the question begins to shift. Instead of asking whether ancient people possessed advanced technology, the issue becomes, by what criteria are we defining their capabilities? By what survives, or by what has vanished? If a society prioritized organic materials, soft techniques, and environmental integration, its traces would fade far faster than stone and metal, but fading does not mean absence. The serpent's gaze proves nothing conclusively. It does not rewrite history, but it forces certainty to pause. It reminds us that ancient human capability may have been more varied than we usually allow ourselves to imagine, that knowledge does not exist only as easily recognizable technology, but also as skill, material sensitivity, and deep relationships with surrounding environments. When that possibility is questioned, the entire picture begins to tremble slightly, not because of a single artifact, but because of its implications. If ancient Amazonian societies were underestimated, then how many traces elsewhere at other times have been overlooked simply because they did not fit familiar templates? From here, the scope of thought must expand not only across space, but in how we approach the past itself. Because when something that should not exist is found, the problem no longer lies with the object, but with the limits of the story long taken for granted. And from those limits, the next question begins to take shape. What does pre-Columbian truly mean if it is no longer seen as a void, but as a world that was once vividly alive? When the serpent's gaze forces certainty to pause, a concept that once felt familiar begins to reveal its cracks. Pre-Columbian. For centuries, the term has served as a convenient marker, a line drawn across the timeline to separate before and after, a moment long treated as a turning point in world history. But the closer one looks, the harder it becomes to believe that the history of an entire continent could be contained by a single voyage. As the concept begins to loosen, what is being questioned is not only chronology, but the very way we choose a starting point for the story. In academic terms, pre-Columbian carries no intention of denial. It simply refers to societies that existed in the Americas before Europeans arrived. Yet in narrative practice, the phrase has gradually turned into a blurred zone, a kind of before history begins, where everything is compressed, flattened, and treated as an incomplete preface to what comes next. In that view, the past is not valued on its own terms, but judged by whether it leads toward Columbus. This creates a subtle paradox. Tens of thousands of years of human life, adaptation, and creativity are reduced to a brief prologue, not because evidence is lacking, but because the ending of the story has already been chosen. When the conclusion is fixed in advance, anything that does not lead directly to it is easily pushed aside. For this reason, the core issue of pre-Columbian is not about who arrived before whom. It lies in a more uncomfortable question. Who is allowed to remain in the story, and who is written out of it? Societies that did not build stone empires, did not leave writing in familiar forms, did not develop along a rhythm that European history labels as progress, are often categorized as transitional, incomplete, or simply gone. Recent discoveries suggest another way of seeing. Pre-Columbian societies were not rough drafts of history, but complete paths shaped by their own internal logic. They were not lacking organization, they organized differently. They were not lacking knowledge, they stored knowledge in ways less durable against time. And precisely because of that, they were more easily erased from collective memory, despite once being vividly present within their landscapes. When the concept of pre-Columbian is detached from its role as a temporal marker, it begins to mean something else. It no longer signifies merely before someone arrived, but before another story came to dominate. A boundary not created by natural history, but by the way humans chose to narrate it. From this perspective, controversial artifacts no longer appear as awkward anomalies. They become fragments of memory from stories never fully told, not because they are too strange, but because they do not fit a framework that has existed for a long time. And as that framework begins to tremble, the certainty surrounding the very idea of pre-Columbian starts to dissolve. It is at this point that attention shifts toward another land, one where the pre-Columbian concept has been studied more deeply than almost anywhere else, yet also constrained most tightly. A space of immense lines drawn across the earth, of arid highlands seemingly incapable of sustaining complex societies, and of legacies long viewed through a single lens. Peru does not emerge as a new destination, but as a test. If the Amazon forced a reconsideration of what wilderness means, Peru poses a different question. Are the things we believe we understand most clearly, in fact, being understood too narrowly? And as the boundaries of pre-Columbian begin to blur, the lines etched across Peru's highlands start to appear not only as remnants, but as an invitation to step into an ancient story where sky, land, and human memory were once bound together in ways that linear history struggles to fully describe. Peru needs no introduction. In collective memory, this land has long been associated with the Nazca Lines, immense figures stretched across an arid plateau, fully visible only from above. That very characteristic for decades shaped how Nazca was understood, as images meant to be seen, to impress, to serve a purpose beyond the experience of anyone standing on the ground. Over time, this perspective quietly reinforced an assumption that the meaning of Nazca lies in the aerial viewpoint rather than in the direct relationship between people, landscape, and lived memory on site. New data consolidated in 2025 does not reject this understanding, but layers additional information onto it. As scans were conducted at higher resolution, one thing became increasingly clear. The figures do not exist in isolation. They are connected, not by continuous lines, but through ordered spatial arrangement, repeating distances, shared orientations, geometric relationships emerging between figures that once seemed unrelated. Newly identified figures do not alter the essence of Nazca, but they deepen the question. Some appear in locations previously overlooked for being too faint, too small, or insufficiently spectacular. When placed within the larger whole, the plateau no longer resembles a scattered gallery of images, but a system, where each line functions like a symbol in a language no longer read fluently. Within this context, astronomical hypotheses no longer stand alone. Rather than asking whether the figures correspond to specific constellations or celestial events, the question gradually shifts. If they relate to the sky, how was that relationship established? Not as a direct copy of star patterns, but as a means of memory, a way of anchoring time and direction into the ground itself. This shift clarifies an important distinction. Symbols are not necessarily knowledge, but knowledge often requires symbols to endure. A figure may carry ritual meaning tied to community, seasons, or relationships with the divine. But when symbols are arranged by rule, when they repeat geometric and astronomical alignments, they begin to exceed a purely ritual function. They become a form of storage, not data in the modern sense, but knowledge encoded in space. This approach does not require Nazca to have telescopes or abstract mathematical systems. It requires only sustained observation and a culture that regarded the sky as inseparable from daily life. In such a context, ritual does not oppose knowledge. Ritual is how knowledge is transmitted, remembered, and reactivated across generations. Recent analyses also suggest that the figures may have been read through movement on the ground. One did not need to see the whole from above to understand it. The Nazca experience may have unfolded through walking the lines, intersections, and open spaces. Through movement, people linked earth and sky. From this perspective, Nazca was not a message sent upward, but a structure that brought the sky closer to human experience. When symbol, ritual, and knowledge merge, the boundary between belief and science begins to blur. Not because Nazca possessed science in the modern sense, but because the categories themselves may not apply cleanly to ancient societies. For them, observing the sky, marking time and maintaining social order may have been a single, unified act. From here, another idea begins to emerge. If Nazca functioned as a spatial system of symbols tied to the sky, then it was not merely art or ritual, it was a kind of map, not a geographic one, but a map of cycles, directions, and relationships between humanity and the cosmos. From that arid plateau, the line of thought expands, no longer just images meant to be seen from above, but traces of a different way of thinking, one in which the ground itself was used to record what could not be touched. And as the idea of a map takes shape, the gaze naturally lifts toward the sky, where the slow movements of stars once guided humans through the night. There, a new possibility waits to be opened, not as a conclusion, but as an approach, that Nazca may be only one part of a much larger structure, where earth and sky were once joined by lines we are only beginning to learn how to read. As Nazca gradually emerges not as a collection of isolated images, but as an ordered system of symbols, a deeper idea begins to surface. For many ancient societies, the sky was not merely a backdrop to the world, but a form of text. Not a text written in letters, but in movement, not read in a single glance, but understood slowly through the accumulated memory of generations. In this view, meaning does not reside in seeing from above, but in living alongside the cycles and rhythms between sky and earth. In that world, the stars are not fixed. They rise, set, and drift imperceptibly over time, forming cycles longer than a human lifetime. It is precisely this slowness that allowed ancient people to observe, compare, and remember. No telescopes were needed, no precise instruments in the modern sense. Only repetition and a community stable enough to look at the same sky across generations. The sky, understood this way, resembles a text without pages. Each night carries a subtle change. Each season adds a new relationship. What is remembered is not the absolute position of each star, but the relationships between them. When a constellation appears alongside planting season, when a star signals the time for ritual, when the sky reveals a misalignment that calls for adjustment in communal life. This knowledge does not exist apart from ritual. It is preserved in song, in dance, in repeated walking paths traced across the ground. When a community participates in ritual together, it is not merely reenacting tradition, it is reading the sky again in the way ancestors once did. Small deviations are corrected over time. Larger changes are noted as signs, not superstition, but an acknowledgement that cosmic order and social order are intertwined. In this context, the question, did they understand astronomy, becomes less appropriate, because understanding here does not mean measuring degrees or minutes of arc. It means knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to adjust the rhythm of life to realign with a larger cycle. This is a form of practical knowledge tightly bound to survival and collective memory. Seen from this perspective, Nazca is not an isolated case. It is a specific expression of a broader approach, one in which the sky serves as a reference framework for life on Earth. When this idea is expanded to a continental scale, another space begins to come into clearer focus: Mesoamerica. Unlike the vast arid Nazca Plateau, Mesoamerica is a world of jungles, highlands, and dense stone cities. There the sky was not spread across the land in monumental lines, but condensed into architecture, calendars, and daily ritual. Pyramids do not merely rise upward, they are aligned with specific astronomical events. Cyclical calendars do not simply track time, they organize the entirety of social life. This difference is not a leap, but a continuation. If Nazca shows how the sky could be unfolded across space, Mesoamerica shows how the sky could be compressed into social structure. Two different approaches sharing the same foundational assumption that the universe can be read, and that humans bear responsibility for remembering what they have read. At this intersection, attention begins to shift toward a more concrete form. From the sky as a living text, knowledge starts to condense into objects, into symbols, into smaller structures carrying larger ambitions, to hold time, to read it, and to transmit it. Within this frame, Mesoamerica appears as a natural point of convergence, a world where calendar, ritual, and architecture intertwine within a worldview in which time does not move in a straight line but coils back on itself in cycles. Within the context of Mesoamerica's complex calendar systems and overlapping rhythms, a controversial artifact gradually comes into view. The so-called time sphere appears neither as a dramatic discovery nor as an anomaly to be dismissed, but as an object that leaves observers uncertain even about how to name it, because it does not fit comfortably into familiar categories. Once again, the issue lies less in the object itself than in whether we are willing to place it within the proper context of an ancient effort. The attempt to read and preserve time in ways we are only beginning to understand. According to early descriptions, the object is small, spherical, or nearly so, its surface intricately decorated with grooves, incised points, and repeating patterns. There are no obvious moving parts, no exposed mechanism that suggests a tool-like function. Yet when examined with modern instruments, some research teams reported difficult-to-classify phenomena, extremely low-level but stable oscillations, along with responses to the surrounding environment that could not be consistently reproduced under laboratory conditions. Notably, no unified conclusion emerged. Some measurements yielded different results when repeated under varying conditions. Certain responses disappeared entirely when the object was relocated. Environmental factors, humidity, temperature, local magnetic fields, appeared to influence behavior in ways that were difficult to isolate or control. This very instability is what turned the time sphere into a problem to be contemplated rather than a discovery that could be quickly categorized. The controversy did not arise because anyone claimed to have found technology ahead of its time, but because no one was entirely sure what was being measured. Some researchers argued that the recorded effects were simply natural physical phenomena amplified by observer expectation. Others were more cautious, not asserting anything extraordinary, yet unable to dismiss the fact that the object did not behave like familiar artifacts. From here, attention began to shift away from the object itself and toward how we interpret it. By calling it a time sphere, we unconsciously assign a function in modern terms, assuming it must measure, emit, or control something. But for many ancient societies, objects did not necessarily exist to operate in an instrumental sense. They could exist to remember, to mark, to embody an abstract concept without requiring motion or mechanical action. In the Mesoamerican worldview, time was not a one-way flow. It was cyclical, a repetition with variation, a relationship between different rhythms of the cosmos and human life. An object associated with time, therefore, did not need to run. It only needed to exist in the right way, in the right place, within the right ritual. Attempting to measure it with modern devices in this context may be akin to trying to measure the meaning of a song with a ruler. This does not mean every uncertainty can be explained away as symbolism, but it forces a more uncomfortable question. Are we searching for function or for familiarity? When faced with an ancient object, we tend to ask what it does rather than what it is within the worldview that produced it. And often it is the gap between those two questions that generates most misunderstandings. The time sphere, then, sits on a fragile boundary. It may be a complex ritual object designed to interact with people rather than machines. It may also be a convergence of natural and human-made factors we do not yet fully understand. In either case, it serves as a reminder that modern language, with concepts like energy, signal, or measurement, is not always the right key for unlocking the past. As this uncertainty spreads, attention gradually moves away from the familiar tropics, where ancient civilizations have been studied for centuries. It turns instead toward another environment, colder, harsher, long considered too hostile for ancient humans to leave lasting traces. A place where time is not recorded in stone calendars or elaborate rituals, but in ice, the Earth's most ruthless and most honest archive. From small, elusive objects in Mesoamerica, the focus of thought begins to drift northward toward the Arctic. Not because clearer answers await there, but because the past is emerging in ways beyond human control. As ice melts, new questions surface, no longer centered on symbols or interpretation, but on existence itself. Do we truly understand what we are looking at when what has been buried for tens of thousands of years begins to appear before our eyes? In that environment, the past is not hidden in soil or stone, but locked inside ice. For most of modern history, ice was treated as a curtain, a cold cover that made any lasting trace of life seem impossible. But the melting of this century has forced that view to reverse. Ice does not only conceal, it preserves, and as that layer of preservation retreats, what emerges is not only artifact, but the fragility of the assumptions we once relied on to understand the past. Unlike soil, where bacteria, water, and geological movement constantly disturb everything, ice is an almost static medium. When an object, a structure, or even a landscape becomes encased in ice, it is not merely buried, but held in a state close to suspended time. Decay slows to an astonishing degree. Movement is restricted. Context is not endlessly disrupted. For this reason, ice becomes a unique ancient archive, not designed for humans, yet far more faithful than any library humans have built. For centuries, that archive lay beyond reach, not because people lacked curiosity, but because nature made access impossible. The Arctic, Siberia, Greenland, these names were associated with harshness, not with human memory. But by the middle of the 2020s, the pace of melting surpassed even the most cautious projections. Ice layers formed at the end of the last ice age began retreating within just a few summers, and with them, what had been preserved for tens of thousands of years started to surface, not in stable condition, but in extreme fragility. The issue is not only what lies beneath the ice, but when and how it appears. Melting does not follow the rhythm of science. It does not wait for surveys for funding or for preservation protocols. Structures newly exposed can deform, collapse, or vanish within a single melt season. This places researchers in a paradoxical position: proceed with proper caution and risk missing everything, react too quickly, and the chances of error and misinterpretation rise sharply. In this context, the first signals from melting regions often arrive before academic consensus can form. Satellites detect unfamiliar lines on the surface. Ice-penetrating radar reveals geometric anomalies that resist easy explanation. Preliminary survey teams report structures they cannot yet classify using familiar language. There is little time left to ask whether we are ready. The past is emerging, whether we are prepared or not. It is this accelerated pace that has made the Arctic one of the most contested spaces in contemporary archaeology. Not because forgotten civilizations are certain to exist there, but because data is appearing faster than interpretation can keep up. Every finding risks being exaggerated, misunderstood, or dismissed too quickly, yet ignoring them grows harder to justify as anomalies accumulate beyond the level of isolated cases. In this way, ice becomes more than a natural environment. It becomes a silent witness. For tens of thousands of years, It preserved what soil and water could not. And as that witness begins to speak, not through words, but through retreat, humanity is forced to listen, even without fully understanding what it is seeing. Among the regions most dramatically affected by rapid melting, Siberia stands out as a particular crossroads, not only because of its vast permafrost, but because it lies at the intersection of ancient migration routes, overlapping climate cycles, and historical gaps never fully filled. If ice is an archive, Siberia feels like a massive door just beginning to open, wide enough to suggest something lies beyond, but not enough to reveal its true nature. From this frozen archive, the line of thought moves deeper, but in a very different direction. No longer focused on small, symbolic or ritual objects, but on structures larger, heavier, and far harder to explain as coincidence. As Siberian ice begins to withdraw, what is revealed is not merely ancient ground, but traces of a presence that forces history to slow down, to look more carefully, before continuing with the familiar story it has long told itself. In this context, Yakutia does not immediately appear as an archaeological hotspot. The region has long been associated with clearly defined discoveries, remarkably preserved Ice Age animal remains, along with scattered traces of ancient nomadic groups. But in certain specific areas, what has begun to emerge does not belong to any familiar category, not bones, not isolated tools. Instead, there are structures with clear mass and form, heavy, stable, and seemingly placed with intention. It is this misalignment that shifts the question away from what they are and toward what may be missing in our systems of classification that prevents us from seeing them clearly. Early reports describe an arrangement of large stone blocks embedded within melting permafrost. There are no intact high walls, no freestanding pillars, no decorative features distinct enough to assign them to a known architectural style. Yet one element is difficult to ignore: the way the stones meet. They are not stacked at random. The contact surfaces are unusually flat, suggesting deliberate shaping before the stones were set in their current positions. The stone fitting technique here is understated. There are no complex joints, no signs of metal use, no visible attempt to project power or symbolism. Still, the precision of the fit implies a significant level of material control. The stones do not appear forced into place. They seem to have been read before being set down, as though the builders understood the shape, weight, and load-bearing points of each block. This does not point to advanced technology in the modern sense, but to accumulated experience, the kind that can only develop when a skill is repeated, refined, and passed down over long periods of time. The real discomfort arises when questions of age are raised. The ice layers surrounding the structures indicate that they existed before permafrost formed at that location. How long before remains difficult to determine. Permafrost does not behave like layered sediment. It can shift, fracture, and refreeze, creating overlapping layers that resist linear reading. Some measurements suggest very early dates, while other analyses remain cautious, asserting only that these structures do not belong to any historically known communities in the region. Because of this ambiguity, researchers have avoided labeling the site as a temple, city, or anything that implies a specific function. They have chosen a more neutral term: structure. Something built, nothing more. No claims of ritual purpose, no hypotheses about power or belief systems. At the current level of evidence, any stronger label risks carrying the narrative further than the data allows. Yet even as mere structures, Yakutia raises an unavoidable question: who built these and under what conditions? Modern Siberia is among the harshest environments on Earth, but Siberia was not always this way. Before permafrost spread across the region, there were periods of milder climate, times when vegetation flourished, animals moved along stable routes, and humans could have lived in ways very different from those possible today. It is here that the line of thought reaches a sensitive boundary in history, the pre-glacial period, not as a mythical age, but as a span still marked by significant gaps in scientific understanding. If the Yakutian structures truly predate the formation of permafrost, they do more than extend the timeline of human presence in the far north. They suggest that humans once adapted to a Siberia that was warmer, more stable, and perhaps capable of supporting long-term activity. This does not require rewriting historical maps overnight. But it does force a pause at a familiar assumption that the world's cold regions have always existed at the margins of human life. Yakutia hints at the opposite, that what is now seen as peripheral may once have held a more central role in a different context, not grand, not enduring, but significant enough to leave traces that even ice could not fully erase. And once the question of the pre-glacial period is opened, it no longer remains confined to Siberia. It draws thought toward even more distant frozen regions, places where thick ice has not only covered land and stone, but also buried long-held assumptions about where humans could have once existed. From the questions raised in Siberia, a problem almost forms on its own. If humans once lived in the Arctic, what did the Arctic look like then? The familiar image we carry today, a frozen, hostile land, nearly incapable of sustaining long-term life, reflects the present, not the full depth of the past. Earth's climate has never been static. Over hundreds of thousands of years, it has oscillated in slow rhythms that a single human lifetime cannot fully perceive. There were periods when ice sheets expanded, but also long, warm intervals lasting thousands of years. During those times, the boundaries of life shifted. Vegetation moved northward, animals followed, and humans, a species that has always moved with its sources of survival, were no exception. Paleoclimate research suggests that the Arctic once experienced conditions far milder than today. Not a paradise, but enough for low vegetation to grow, enough for large animals to thrive, and enough for humans to stop, at least seasonally. In that context, the Arctic was not a barrier separating continents, but a transitional space, a living corridor linking lands now divided by ice and ocean. The idea of such corridors is not new, but for a long time it has been framed narrowly as short-term migration routes. People passed through, then left. They did not stay. They did not invest. Yet recent data makes that view feel incomplete. If humans merely pass through, why are there signs of repeated preparation? Why do we see concentrations, structures, or signals suggesting these places were treated as parts of lived space rather than temporary passages? Living corridors, understood more broadly, need not be cities or permanent settlements. They can be networks of seasonal stopping points used again and again across generations. Places people returned to because they knew there was water, food, familiar terrain. When climate shifted, these corridors could be severed, submerged under ice or rising seas, causing entire networks to vanish from the visible surface of history. This leads to a possibility that is difficult to grasp, yet increasingly difficult to ignore, that a significant portion of human history unfolded in spaces that no longer exist in a physical sense, not because they were destroyed by war or sudden catastrophe, but because the Earth itself restructured its surface. When movement routes disappeared, memory faded with them, especially if the communities that used them left no durable architecture behind. In this light, the central question is no longer, could humans live in the Arctic, but rather, how did the Arctic once allow humans to live? And when that question is posed, one vast mass of ice begins to draw attention in a very different way: Greenland. Today, Greenland stands as a symbol of permanent ice, a land almost entirely locked beneath sheets kilometers thick. Yet it also sits precisely where hypothetical ancient living corridors would converge between the Americas and Europe, between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. If there was ever a moment when climate allowed human lifeways to extend northward, Greenland could hardly be absent from that picture. Like Siberia, Greenland is not waiting for science to be fully prepared. Its ice is retreating, revealing signals that once existed only in models and hypotheses. They are not yet decisive evidence nor clear answers, but they are enough to disrupt, forcing researchers to return to an old question with a different posture. Was the Arctic truly always the edge of the human world, or was it once part of it before ice closed in, and the memory of those living spaces slowly slipped out of the familiar story we tell about the past? As attention turns toward Greenland, a phrase quickly spreads across global media: a city beneath the ice. The words strike the imagination, conjuring visions of intact urban structures sleeping for tens of thousands of years under thick ice sheets. Yet between the appeal of that label and scientific reality lies a considerable gap, a space where raw data, academic debate, and public expectation collide, moving at very different speeds. What ice-penetrating radar actually records is not a city, but anomalies. The wave returns reveal extended flat surfaces, repeating geometries, and clear boundaries between material layers. In scientific language, these are signals of interest, enough to raise questions but not enough to assign names. Radar does not see walls or buildings. It detects differences in how materials reflect energy, and those differences can arise from many sources: unusual geology, unevenly compressed ice, or structures that fall outside categories we currently know how to describe. Problems begin when these signals are pulled out of their technical context. Diagrams that require multiple layers of explanation are quickly simplified into more intuitive images. Straight lines become streets. Repeating reflective blocks become residential zones. In this translation, scientific language, cautious and conditional by nature, gives way to narrative language, not because anyone intends to mislead, but because the human imagination tends to fill uncertainty with familiar forms. Within the research community, the debate moves at a different pace. Some scientists argue that repeating geometries could result from complex glaciological processes, where pressure and slow ice movement create patterns that appear intentional. Others do not dismiss natural explanations, yet point out that the regularity of certain signals is difficult to attribute entirely to geology. Between these positions lies a broad grey zone, one where current data cannot justify conclusions, but also cannot be ignored. It is precisely this grey zone that media attention amplifies most strongly. In an attention-driven environment, discoveries described as unclear are rarely presented with their full ambiguity intact. Uncertainty is often treated as weakness, when in reality it is the natural state of science in its early stages. A possibility is quickly read as a claim. And once that claim spreads, returning to a more cautious posture becomes increasingly difficult. Here, a paradox emerges. Media exposure allows data to reach the public faster than ever before, yet simultaneously widens the gap between the data and how it is understood. In Greenland's case, the question, "Is there a city or not?" grows so large that it obscures far more subtle and important questions. What do these anomalies tell us about Greenland's environmental history? What do they reveal about the landscape before it was buried under ice? And could they hint at how humans, if they were ever present, oriented and organized space in an environment that was always in flux? At this point, science is forced to adjust its tempo. Rather than rushing toward conclusions, attention returns to a more fundamental reality. Greenland before the ice was a very different landscape. And if ice functions as an archive, then radar anomalies are not final answers. but signals indicating that something deserves closer examination. Not cities in the modern sense, but structures, natural or human-made, that were once part of an ancient terrain. When the noise of media narratives is set aside, another approach begins to emerge. Instead of searching for familiar urban traces, researchers turn to how ancient humans may have read and oriented space in the Arctic. In a land where terrain is often hidden, where horizons shift with the seasons, and ice continually reshapes the surface, the sky becomes the most stable reference point available. From the controversies surrounding the city beneath the ice, the line of thought gradually lifts upward, away from ground and ice, toward the Arctic sky. In a space where ice and prolonged darkness blur familiar orders, the stars do more than guide movement. They provide the only enduring framework of organization. From there, another possibility begins to take shape, that to understand what may once have existed beneath the ice, we must first understand how ancient people relied on the sky in regions where the ground itself could never be trusted to remain the same. As attention shifts fully to the Arctic sky, a different kind of discovery begins to emerge, no less unsettling, and in some ways more profound than the structures buried beneath the ice. Not because of its scale, but because of its location. It appears in places where, according to long-held assumptions, humans were not thought to have lived long enough to form anything resembling an organized system. This misalignment pushes the question away from what has been found and toward the limits we rely on to decide what is even possible. On cliff faces and cave surfaces in the high Arctic, researchers have documented engravings and markings arranged with clear intentionality. They are not familiar hunting scenes nor spontaneous symbols. The lines repeat with purpose. Clusters of dots and strokes connect in patterns that, when viewed in the right context, begin to resemble star maps. Not direct copies of the modern sky, but structures reflecting relationships between points of light, relationships that can only be recognized through long-term observation. The difficulty arises immediately with dating. Some associated sediment layers suggest these markings may be extremely old, far older than the timelines in which humans, under prevailing models, are thought to have maintained a stable presence in these regions. Not a difference of centuries, but of tens of thousands of years. A gap large enough to turn a technical question into a conceptual one. From here, debate no longer centers on whether the markings are real, but on a deeper issue. Who do we mean when we say humans? In archaeology, human presence is typically identified through familiar markers: stone tools, dwellings, continuous traces of daily life. These astronomical engravings do not fit that list. They tell no story of subsistence or routine survival. They seem to record only one relationship, that between people and the sky. This opens two difficult possibilities. One is that these engravings were indeed created by very early communities, living under conditions we do not yet fully understand, leaving behind little else beyond observational symbols. The other is that they were made much later by groups arriving afterward, and that we are inadvertently reading time backward, assigning them an age they do not belong to. The second possibility is often considered safer. History is familiar with cases where later people misinterpret older landscapes and assign meanings beyond reality. Yet this explanation also has limits. The engravings are not random. They display consistent spatial relationships repeated across sites, consistency that is difficult to achieve without a shared frame of reference, a sky observed, remembered, and transmitted. The first possibility, though harder to accept, raises more penetrating questions. If these engravings truly are that ancient, they challenge not only timelines, but how we imagine human presence itself. Not as dense populations leaving layered remains, but as small, mobile groups capable of observation and memory far beyond what is usually attributed to the earliest phases of humanity. Here the confusion becomes most apparent. We tend to look for humans where they stayed, but these astronomical engravings suggest a different mode of existence, one defined by observation, by marking cycles that extend beyond a single lifetime. In that view, the question of who drew them may not have a simple answer. The maker may have been many generations, each adding a small mark, until the system exceeded individual memory altogether. Seen this way, the idea of places where humans never existed may simply mean places where humans were never recorded by familiar criteria. And as those criteria begin to falter, the Arctic findings no longer stand alone. They connect to a longer chain, from the Amazon to Nazca to Mesoamerica to Siberia and Greenland, where anomalies appear in vastly different contexts, yet share a common trait. They do not fit the historical story already laid out. From star maps in the polar regions, the gaze expands to a global scale. The question is no longer about a single site or culture, but about the possibility of a recurring pattern, anomalies appearing in distant, unrelated places, across contrasting climates and geographies, yet converging on the same uncertainty. Are these merely rare exceptions, or fragmented remnants of a much larger picture? One that has remained invisible for so long precisely because it has been scattered beyond recognition. When the star maps of the polar regions no longer stand alone within the argument, the response that forms is not astonishment, but caution. In science, a single discovery can always be an error, a disturbed stratigraphic layer, a measurement not yet precise enough, or an interpretation stretched beyond the data. These possibilities are not alarming, they are essential to how understanding progresses. For that reason, the crucial question is not how quickly to conclude, but when the number of anomalies becomes too large to continue treating them as coincidence. But when similar findings emerge simultaneously in places with no direct connection across entirely different geographical and cultural context, the concept of error begins to lose its familiar protective role. Not because each individual discovery is certainly correct, but because the likelihood that all of them are wrong in the same way becomes increasingly difficult to justify. The Amazon, with landscapes once subtly managed, Nazca, with spatial symbol systems tightly bound to the sky, Mesoamerica, with objects tied to time in ways that resist easy interpretation, Siberia and Greenland with structures and anomalies revealed by melting ice, the Arctic with astronomical engravings in places humans were not supposed to have inhabited. Each case, taken alone, can be questioned, but when placed side by side they begin to form a rhythm, quiet, uneven, yet repeating often enough to force science to slow down and look more carefully. Here a subtle shift takes place. The question moves from "is this correct?" to "what is causing these things to keep appearing?" The difference between the two questions is slight, but the consequences are not. The first targets individual discoveries, the second targets the framework used to evaluate them. Science has passed through moments like this before. When planetary orbits failed to match predictions, physics was not rewritten overnight, but the discrepancies could not be ignored. When fossil layers appeared where they should not, geology was forced to expand its sense of time. In each case, it was not the shock value of a single finding, but the repetition of anomalies that created the turning point. This is especially significant for archaeology, a field accustomed to fragmentation. Cultures are studied in isolation, regions are divided along modern borders, narratives are told within time frames narrow enough to remain manageable. But the recent anomalies do not respect this fragmentation. They appear across continents, across climates, and across long-standing assumptions about where knowledge can form. Viewed this way, the question is no longer whether a forgotten global civilization once existed. It becomes more modest and harder to avoid. Might humans in the past have interacted with environment, time, and space in ways far more diverse than linear history allows us to imagine? And if so, how many of those ways vanished along with the conditions that once sustained them? This shift in perspective turns attention back to a region long considered thoroughly understood, the Mediterranean. Not because it lacks research, but because it is so familiar. Every island, every coastline, every ruin has been measured, excavated, and anchored to a stable timeline. Yet familiarity can cause small anomalies to be overlooked, or explained in the safest possible way. When anomalies no longer appear isolated on the global map, the Mediterranean is reconsidered through a different lens. Not to search for something entirely new, but to ask whether traces that have always been there, beneath the water, beneath sediment, or beneath overly solid assumptions, are waiting to be recognized through a changed way of seeing. At the crossroads of ancient civilizations between sea and land, a structure lying deep beneath blue water begins to draw attention, not because it promises a sensational story, but because it echoes the same question that has surfaced in so many other contexts. Is this simply another error, or part of a broader pattern, one that only becomes visible once enough pieces have appeared to suggest a whole? The structures on the Mediterranean seafloor do not arrive as a shock. They seep slowly into awareness, like memories surfacing only after the sea has withdrawn long enough. Massive stone blocks resting off the coast of Malta hint at a landscape that was once very different: lower sea levels, longer shorelines, and more space for people to live, build, and eventually leave. Not a city destroyed, but traces submerged along with the very conditions that once allowed them to exist. That quiet disappearance is precisely why these structures do not sit outside the emerging line of thought, but fit seamlessly into a growing question that is becoming harder to ignore, about worlds that once existed before water, ice, and time closed over them. Placing Malta alongside Yonaguni on the opposite side of the world is not an attempt to force a single explanation, but to recognize a familiar pattern. Stone terraces, broad flat surfaces, right angles that suggest deliberate intervention, yet remain ambiguous enough to be explained as the outcome of geological processes. The debate persists not because of a lack of data, but because the data sits precisely on an uncomfortable boundary between natural formation and human intent. And it is this boundary, more than any conclusion, that matters, because whether in Malta, Yonaguni, or other submerged structures scattered around the world, one common factor is always present: sea level. After the last ice age, global sea levels rose by tens of meters over a period short enough that coastal communities had little chance to adapt architecturally. What once lay on dry land became seafloor. Routes, gathering places, and ritual spaces vanished from maps, not because they were destroyed, but because they were covered. In that context, finding structures underwater is no longer unusual. What is unusual is how we respond to them. When a site lies on land, we instinctively treat it as part of human history. When that same site lies underwater, suspicion immediately arises. Not necessarily because the evidence is weaker, but because it does not fit our familiar image of where humans were supposed to exist in the past. Sea level, in this sense, is more than an environmental factor. It is a ruthless editor of human maps. It erases once crucial living spaces and leaves behind fragmented stories. Coastal societies, often flexible, dispersed, and less inclined to build permanent monuments, become silent casualties of rising waters. When they retreat, their memory retreats with them, except for what is heavy enough to remain behind. From here, the question shifts. It is no longer simply, were these structures made by humans, but what did humans invest in within spaces that are now submerged? If a community was stable enough to create terraces, platforms, or large stone constructions, it likely possessed other skills alongside them, not only in architecture, but in material handling more broadly. Linear history is comfortable with a progression from stone to metal, but placed within the context of submerged landscapes, that progression becomes far less clear. Metal does not survive well underwater, and its traces vanish far more easily than stone. This opens a difficult but unavoidable possibility that ancient coastal societies may have developed material techniques we no longer see simply because the environment did not allow them to endure. Underwater megaliths, then, do not speak only of architecture. They remind us that a significant portion of human history unfolded on lands that no longer exist on our maps. And when maps change, the criteria by which we recognize advancement must change with them. Not every skill leaves durable traces. Not every form of knowledge is carved into stone. From here, the line of thought continues to shift. From stone, the most resilient against time, toward metal, more refined yet far more vulnerable to environment. If rising seas can erase entire living spaces, how many traces of early metallurgy disappeared with them? And if anything remains, it is unlikely to lie beneath the waves, but rather in dry, inland regions, places where time has had fewer chances to erase the marks of human presence. As attention shifts away from spaces once submerged and turns toward harsh inland terrain, another paradox comes into view, not beneath water, but in the heart of the desert. The Gobi, with its powerful winds, dry sands, and intense oxidation, is an environment where metal should disappear fastest. For that reason, any iron traces that persist here over long periods are not merely surprising. They demand serious questioning of the very conditions that allow them to exist. The recorded iron pillars and metal masses do not appear within the familiar landscape of ancient metallurgy. There are no furnaces, no slag, no signs of a production chain. They appear scattered, unlinked to identifiable settlements, sometimes buried deep within hardened, dry sediment, sometimes exposed on the surface. What unsettles researchers is not their quantity, but their physical state. In an oxygen-rich environment marked by extreme temperature fluctuations and constant sand abrasion, iron typically degrades rapidly. Yet some samples show significantly lower levels of corrosion than physical models would predict. Initial material analyses have yielded no definitive answers. The metal composition is not fully pure, but it also does not align with modern alloys. Some hypotheses point toward natural origins, meteorites or rare geological processes. Others are more cautious, not excluding human involvement, but emphasizing that this does not necessarily imply large-scale metallurgy or advanced technology in the conventional sense. The issue, then, is not the iron objects themselves, but how tightly we bind metal to a fixed developmental sequence. In linear history, iron appears late, alongside complex societies, structured production, and distribution systems. The Gobi traces do not fit that sequence. They do not imply a recognizable social structure, nor do they form a continuous technical tradition. They exist as isolated cases, insufficient to define a period, yet resistant to dismissal as pure coincidence. Here, the question must remain open, not who smelted the iron, but where did this material come from, and how could it persist here for so long? Its origin does not have to be tied to an industry or a clear technological leap. It may be the result of rare conditions, unusual material properties, specific environmental factors, and brief craft practices, existing long enough to leave traces, but not long enough to become tradition. What makes the Gobi iron traces noteworthy is not that they force a rewrite of metallurgical history, but that they once again reveal the limits of familiar classification frameworks. Like submerged structures or formations emerging from ice, they sit at the edge of what we consider reasonable. Not clear enough to conclude, but concrete enough to compel science to pause. And as questions about materials continue to accumulate, attention shifts once more, no longer toward extreme environments, but upward. The Andes, with their altitude, complex terrain, and ritual traditions bound to stone, sound, and space, open a different line of inquiry. There the focus moves away from durability or decay and toward how humans perceived, organized, and read the world, not only through tools, but through the full, embodied experience of being present within space itself. From the puzzling traces of metal in the desert, the line of thought continues upward into the high mountain ranges, not to seek more durable materials, but to observe a different kind of interaction between humans and their environment. At altitudes where the air thins and wind and stone dominate, the world is no longer experienced primarily through sight. Here, sound becomes the guiding element, echoes rebounding from cliff faces, wind threading through rock fissures, vibrations traveling through the ground. In this setting, stone is not merely a building material, but part of a sensory landscape. Carved and arranged stone slabs on the Andean plateaus have long been interpreted as products of art or ritual. But when approached not through form but through response, through how they interact with sound, another dimension begins to emerge. In certain locations, sound does not disperse randomly. Some frequencies are amplified, others dampened, creating stable zones of resonance. These effects are not rare in nature, but their repeated appearance at sites deliberately chosen by humans suggests intentional attention to how space answers sound. This does not require measurement systems in the modern sense. It requires only the repeated presence of human bodies in space, standing, moving, making sound, listening, remembering. Knowledge here is not abstracted into formulas, but accumulated through experience. It need not be called science, yet it is difficult to dismiss as chance. In many Andean traditions, ritual is not merely symbolic action, but a way of organizing collective perception. Sound, from chanting and drums to footsteps, shapes sacred space. A place is open when sound returns clearly. A place is closed when calls are swallowed by silence. Space, then, is not defined by distance or direction, but by sensory feedback. This knowledge is not written down, but transmitted through shared experience. It is here that a limitation of modern archaeology becomes clear. Our methods prioritize what can be seen, measured, and archived. Stone is treated as static. Space is reduced to diagrams, but sound leaves no sediment. When ritual ends, acoustic knowledge dissipates with it, unless it is anchored in the placement of stone and the shaping of space itself. The sound-responsive stones of the Andes, therefore, are not evidence of lost technology, but rare surviving traces of a way of understanding the world grounded in direct perception. An approach aimed not at controlling the environment, but at attuning to it. When placed alongside star maps, structures emerging from ice, and other difficult-to-classify findings, the issue shifts away from individual cases toward a broader question about how knowledge itself once formed. If ancient humans understood the world through hearing, movement, and rhythm, things that resist inscription, then much of that knowledge may have vanished without leaving clear material traces. And if what we now label as anomalies are merely the few remaining anchors of such knowledge, the problem may not be that they are too strange, but that we have grown accustomed to reading the past through only certain senses. From this point, the focus no longer rests on isolated discoveries, but turns back on how we define knowledge and progress themselves. When the stones of the Andes force us to listen to the past rather than simply observe it, the question shifts. away from what once existed and toward how we choose to recognize it. When we face the past, what we are truly searching for is not always data. Sometimes it is reassurance. A sense that humanity did not emerge from nothing, that before the present, there were communities who understood the world in deep ways, even if they left no stories that fit our familiar historical frameworks. This question is not loud, but it quietly shapes how we respond to every disruptive discovery. Because whenever an object or structure appears that should not exist, the first reaction is rarely purely scientific. It touches directly on our sense of where humanity stands within time. If the past was more diverse, more complex, and less linear than we were taught, then the present no longer feels like an inevitable destination. For some, this opens a feeling of connection. For others, it creates unease. At a deeper level, these reactions reflect a distinctly modern anxiety: rupture. We live in an age of rapid knowledge accumulation, yet our collective memory is short. When we encounter traces of ancient understanding erased by ice, water, or time, the feeling that arises is not only curiosity, but concern, that something once existed and vanished, and that we ourselves may be moving along a similar path. This is why not every bold hypothesis is embraced purely because of its evidentiary strength. Some are welcomed because of the meaning they offer. The meaning that humans were once more deeply entangled with their environment. The meaning that knowledge does not advance along a single axis. And the meaning that questioning one's place in the universe is not a uniquely modern anxiety, but an act with a long human history. At the same time, there are reactions that are clearly defensive. When the past becomes too complex, it threatens the stability of the narratives that help us organize the world. Holding tightly to familiar models is not only an academic choice, but a psychological one. It preserves a sense of control, the belief that history can still be systematized, taught, and passed on without unsettling the foundations of how we understand reality. It is here that the boundary between science and psychology begins to blur. Science does not exist apart from people. It is practiced by individuals carrying expectations, fears, and cognitive limits that are very real. When a disruptive discovery appears, debate is not only about whether it is correct, but also about a quieter question: what are we willing to accept, and how far? Recognizing this does not weaken science. On the contrary, it helps explain why intense debates so often erupt around topics like origins, deep time, or the capabilities of ancient humans. These are not merely arguments over data. They are arguments about identity, about where we come from, and how that shapes the way we understand ourselves. For this reason, a shift becomes necessary. To prevent emotion from steering conclusions, science must return to its core principles: skepticism, verification, and patience. Not to suppress imagination, but to place it properly. Not to avoid large questions, but to ensure that the way we approach them is not driven more by psychological need than by evidence. From here, the line of thought enters a different phase. Emotional reactions begin to recede, making room for a scientific process that is slow, exacting, and often disappointing. Not because science holds all the answers, but because only within that space do unsettling discoveries have a chance to be placed where they belong, not as promises or threats, but as questions to be worked through step by step over long stretches of time. When the layer of emotional reaction is set aside, science returns to its familiar rhythm: slow, cautious, and sometimes cold to outside observers. Yet it is precisely this coldness that clarifies science's core function. Its goal is not to confirm the most appealing ideas, but to eliminate what is wrong before allowing any conclusion to stand. Faced with an unsettling discovery, the first response is rarely acceptance. It is skepticism. Not skepticism meant to deny, but skepticism as a method. The question is not, is this interesting, but where could this be wrong? Has the stratigraphy been disturbed? Could the sample be contaminated? Are there systematic measurement errors? And is there a simpler explanation that has not yet been fully exhausted? Skepticism in this sense is not meant to destroy a finding, but to test its strength. A result only begins to matter once it survives the hardest questions. For this reason, discoveries that touch the foundations of history are rarely welcomed. They are held in prolonged scrutiny, repeated, placed in different contexts, and examined by those who were not involved in the original work. After skepticism comes critique, not personal critique, but structural critique. Data is passed to independent teams, other laboratories, researchers with no stake in the outcome. The goal is not rapid consensus, but controlled disagreement. Each differing perspective becomes a new stress test. If a conclusion remains standing after those collisions, it begins to accumulate scientific weight. Then comes replication, the least visible stage, precisely because it lacks drama. A phenomenon must recur under similar conditions and ideally under different ones. If a result appears only once, in one place, with a single research group, it cannot yet serve as the foundation for any larger story. Science requires repetition not because it lacks imagination, but because imagination only has value when anchored to reality. It is at this stage that many high-profile discoveries fade from media attention, not because they are disproven, but because they enter a suspended state, not wrong enough to discard, yet not solid enough to accept. This state can last for years, even decades, and for those who expect quick answers, it is the most uncomfortable outcome of all. But science does not move at the pace of eagerness. Its own history shows that the most seductive ideas are often the most misleading. Some hypotheses were once celebrated only to be withdrawn. Others were ignored only to be confirmed much later. Between these outcomes, there is no reliable shortcut. This is especially true for discoveries related to human origins and ancient capabilities. Each new conclusion does not merely add a detail to history, it can force an adjustment of the entire interpretive framework. In that context, science is not only protecting the accuracy of individual data points, but also the stability of shared knowledge, the foundation that allows future generations to keep asking questions without having to rebuild everything from scratch. From the outside, this process can look like hesitation. From the inside, it is a sign of seriousness. Science rarely says no to uncomfortable ideas. What it says far more often is not yet. And within that not yet lie two things at once: openness to the possibility that we have misunderstood, and responsibility not to replace one incomplete story with another that is more appealing but no less fragile. It is in this tension between new data and established procedures that genuine scientific debate begins, not as a confrontation between right and wrong, but as an extended trial where each discovery must prove its worth over time. And here, a sensitive boundary slowly comes into view, the line between necessary skepticism and disguised denial, where science must examine itself carefully to ensure that caution does not harden into an obstacle to new understanding. When science operates in accordance with its true nature, asking questions, challenging results, and insisting on verification, it creates the necessary space for knowledge to grow without being distorted by expectation. Yet it is precisely within that space that a fragile boundary begins to appear, the boundary between skepticism and denial. The two can look similar on the surface, but they lead to entirely different outcomes. One opening the path to understanding, the other closing the door to dialogue. Skepticism is a forward-looking tool. It does not pre-decide conclusions, but delays them until the data is strong enough to stand on its own. A skeptical scientist does not say, "This cannot happen," but rather, "This has not yet been demonstrated sufficiently." Skepticism accepts the possibility of being wrong, and that acceptance is what makes it flexible, capable of adjusting when new evidence emerges. Denial, by contrast, often begins with a conclusion already in place. When data does not fit, instead of expanding the interpretive framework, it seeks to protect the existing model. New evidence is not treated as an opportunity to understand more deeply, but as a threat to be neutralized. In this state, the question is no longer what do we not yet understand, but why this cannot be true. What makes these two attitudes so easy to confuse lies in language. The same statement, "We do not yet have enough evidence," can reflect honest skepticism or serve as an indefinite postponement designed to avoid confronting something inconvenient. Distinguishing between the two requires more than technical skill. It requires self-awareness. Are we defending method, or are we defending a familiar story? The history of science shows that this boundary has been crossed many times. Some discoveries were dismissed not because the evidence was weak, but because they did not fit the dominant framework of their time. Some data remained labeled unconvincing for decades, until a later generation, less invested in the old narrative, returned to examine it with fresh eyes. This does not make science culpable, but it does remind us that science always operates within cultural and psychological contexts. When recent anomalies are viewed through this lens, from the Amazon to the Arctic, from beneath the sea to the desert, the question is no longer whether skepticism is appropriate. Skepticism is essential. The question becomes whether we are unintentionally sliding into denial, simply because these findings force us to reconsider things once thought settled. Denial tends to appear most strongly in areas where history is believed to be complete. When a region, a period, or a model is treated as stable, any mismatched data is easily dismissed as noise. Yet it is precisely in such places that the risk of flattening history is greatest, not because new pieces are wrong, but because they do not fit into a framework that has already closed itself. From here, another concept begins to surface: forgotten history. Not history deliberately erased, but history neglected because it does not align with the dominant narrative. Societies that did not build empires, knowledge that was never carved into stone, ways of living that did not last long enough to be recorded. They were not loudly rejected, they were simply not mentioned. The boundary between skepticism and denial therefore does more than shape how science responds to new discoveries. It also shapes what is allowed to exist within collective memory. When denial prevails, history becomes tidy but impoverished. When skepticism is kept in its proper place, history becomes more complex and closer to reality. From this point, the line of thought shifts once more, not toward places where anomalies are clearly visible, but toward spaces where absence itself becomes meaningful. Gaps, silences, chapters of history never written, not because there were no people or no events, but because they did not fit the way the past had grown accustomed to being told. When attention moves away from the boundary between skepticism and denial and turns instead toward the gaps in history, a long-held assumption begins to loosen, that every civilization sought to leave a mark, to be remembered, to extend its influence across time. Looking more slowly reveals that the opposite has also existed. Societies that did not pursue legacy, did not build empires, and did not attempt to carve their names into history. In such societies, resilience was not measured by endurance in others' memory, but by the ability to exist in balance with their own environment. The absence of monumental traces was not a failure, but the outcome of a different choice, a choice not to magnify human presence beyond the surrounding landscape. We are accustomed to recognizing civilization through what survives: stone cities, writing, metals, durable constructions. But these are only the forms of civilization that pass through the filter of material time. They do not represent the full range of ways humans have organized life. There were societies that developed along other logics, without centralized power, without territorial expansion through conquest, and without treating remembrance as a measure of success. In these societies, stability may have mattered more than growth. Flexibility was valued over control. Social structures and living spaces were designed to change, to be dismantled, or to disappear when they no longer fit. When environments shifted, climates turned, waters moved, vegetation declined, the response was not always resistance. It could be withdrawal, dispersal, or integration into other communities. Such transitions rarely leave clear moments of collapse, no fallen empires, no destroyed centers of power, only gradual dissolution, subtle enough for nature and time to erase the traces quickly. It is this quietness that causes these societies to nearly vanish from history as we usually understand it, not because they were undeveloped, but because their mode of existence did not produce easily recognizable markers for posterity. When forests regrow, when ice advances, when seas rise, these light traces disappear far faster than the memories of societies built in stone and metal. What remains is not ruins, but absence, an absence that is difficult to interpret within familiar historical frameworks. This poses a fundamental challenge to how we read the past. If we only search for empires, history will always look like the story of empires. But if much of human history was shaped by societies that did not aim to leave durable marks, then what we now label as exceptions may in fact be the remaining fragments of a broader pattern long obscured. The anomalies appearing today, faint structures, techniques that leave no long developmental chain, traces that resist classification, in this light are not necessarily strange. They may be the rare remnants of paths that did not aim for long-term material permanence, and therefore did not survive the harsh filtering of history. Here, the question is no longer why those societies disappeared, but why we expect them to have left something that looks like us. That expectation reflects present values more than past realities. And when we force the past to conform to those values, we inadvertently erase other ways of being, ways that once functioned effectively within their own contexts. Societies that dissolve into their environments do not leave heroic epics behind, but they may leave other lessons, quieter ones, about flexibility, about knowing when to withdraw, and about not treating endless expansion as inevitable. These lessons are difficult to read because they are not carved into stone. They emerge only when we accept that history is not just the story of those who remained, but also of those who chose or were compelled to disappear. And from this disappearance, another question slowly takes shape, unhurried yet unavoidable. If much of human history was formed by societies that did not build empires, how much knowledge vanished with them? How much of what we now call anomalies are simply fragments of a much wider past, one in which memory was not preserved through power, but through dissolution into the world itself? When we accept that not every civilization aimed to leave behind an empire, another consequence slowly comes into view. Not all knowledge needs stone and metal in order to exist. Ironically, the forms of knowledge that once allowed humans to adapt most deeply to their environments are often the very forms that vanish most easily from history, not because they were fragile, but because they left behind no traces that history has learned how to recognize. Before writing appeared, before architecture was built to resist time, humans stored their understanding in other ways. Individual memory flowed into collective memory. Knowledge was not fixed through inscription, but kept alive through repetition. Ritual, in this context, was not merely an expression of belief, but a system of information transfer, about seasons, about the sky, about terrain, and about the limits of survival a community needed to remember. In that world, knowledge was not static. It moved with people. It was repeated, adjusted, and adapted to circumstance rather than frozen into a single form. A song could carry a record of environmental observation. A sequence of movements could encode spatial knowledge. A story that sounded mythical might preserve a memory spanning generations of climate shifts, floods, or changing land. No writing was required, no monuments were necessary. All that was needed was the continued existence of the community and the practice itself. Yet it is precisely this vitality that makes non-material knowledge so vulnerable to history. When a community dissolves, when ritual is interrupted, when a language disappears, the entire storage system can collapse within 1 or 2 generations. It leaves no sediment, it leaves nothing to excavate. Only gaps remain. Gaps that later histories are often forced to fill with conjecture. Modern archaeology, by the nature of its methods, prioritizes what can be handled and measured: stone, bone, metal, materials that resist decay. But the knowledge transmitted through speech, movement, and lived experience does not resist time in the same way. It depends entirely on an unbroken human chain. When that chain breaks, the knowledge does not slowly fade. It disappears completely, leaving no evidence that it ever existed. This creates a deep bias in how we read the past. Societies that stored knowledge in durable materials are easily seen as advanced. Societies that stored knowledge in memory and practice are easily dismissed as simple. Not because they lacked understanding, but because their understanding could not pass through the harsh filter of material time. When the anomalies that have emerged are viewed in this light, they begin to take on a different meaning. Faint structures, hard to classify objects, traces that do not form long developmental chains. These may not be evidence of incomplete knowledge. They may be rare physical anchors left behind by knowledge systems that existed largely outside material form. And because they are anchors, they appear isolated, fragmented, and difficult to explain. The ritual context that once gave them meaning is gone. The living communities that could read them no longer exist. They have been separated from the systems that made them intelligible. In this state, they are easily labeled anomalies or even errors, rather than recognized as the final remnants of a lost mode of knowledge storage. Knowledge that required neither stone nor metal was sufficient for thousands of years of survival, but it was not sufficient to survive major disruptions: melting ice, rising seas, disease, migration, or cultural collision. When those breaks occurred, material history continued, while the history of memory fell silent. Out of that silence, an unavoidable question slowly takes shape. If much of human knowledge once existed in non-material form, then what we call complete history may only be the small fraction that survived the brutal filtering of time. And seen this way, the anomalies now appearing may not be random fragments at all, but faint signals from a once far larger reservoir of knowledge, a reservoir that vanished so quickly that history itself did not realize what it had just lost. When we accept that knowledge does not need to be preserved in stone or metal in order to exist, a question once dismissed as too vague begins to return. This time, it no longer appears as a fringe speculation, but as a framing possibility that deserves serious consideration. Before the milestones we commonly use to structure history, agriculture, cities, writing, could there have been other phases of development operating by different logics and ending without leaving traces that fit our familiar criteria of recognition? This question does not assume a lost golden age, nor does it imply a global civilization with superior technology. It does not seek to overturn the foundational milestones of established history. What it proposes is far more modest: that human history may have passed through other modes of understanding and organization, ones that did not necessarily lead toward materially durable forms and therefore are not easily captured within the historical frameworks we are used to. From this perspective, history does not move in a straight line from simple to complex. It behaves more like a spiral with phases of accumulated knowledge, social organization, and environmental understanding interrupted by disruptions caused by climate shifts, geological change, or transformations beyond the limits of adaptation. After each disruption, humanity does not restart from nothing, but neither does it continue intact from where it left off. Some knowledge is retained, some disappears, and some re-emerges in altered forms under new conditions. Seen this way, the anomalies that have surfaced no longer need to be interpreted as things ahead of their time. They may simply be remnants of earlier turns in the spiral, moments when humans reached certain levels of subtlety in understanding space, sky, materials, or environmental perception, but did not persist long enough or leave sufficient material traces to become stable foundations for what followed. This approach also helps explain why such findings tend to appear scattered, lacking synchronicity and failing to form clear developmental sequences. If knowledge was transmitted primarily through memory, ritual, and practice, then when those chains were broken, what remained would look like exceptions, not because they belonged to a separate civilization, but because the context that once gave them meaning no longer exists. The idea of an era before the era, in this sense, does not require belief in a deliberately hidden past. It only requires acknowledging that history, as we write it, tends to favor stable periods that leave durable traces. Other phases, shorter, more flexible, more dependent on environmental balance, may have passed without being recorded, not because they were insignificant, but because they did not withstand time in the way material history demands. Within this spiral movement, progress is not always cumulative. Sometimes it is rediscovery. A skill may appear, vanish, and later reappear in a completely different context. An understanding of the sky may be preserved through practice, lost and then reformed elsewhere through independent observation. Similarities between cultures separated by vast distances and times, therefore, do not necessarily point to direct contact. They may reflect recurring patterns in how humans respond to the same world. Viewing history as a spiral does not diminish the importance of familiar milestones. Agriculture, cities, and writing remain major turning points, but they may not have been the first times humans engaged with order, prediction, and social organization. They may simply be the most durable instances that survived, not the only ones that ever existed. And if we accept that possibility, then the anomalies appearing today no longer seem like random fragments. They become rare points of contact between the present and earlier turns of human history. Not clear enough to redraw the entire picture, but sufficient to remind us that the picture may be broader than the frame we are currently using. From here, the line of thought does not move toward a grand conclusion. Instead, it steps back and shifts focus to a different question. Not whether a pre-era era existed, but how we choose to face that possibility. Because what matters most is not affirming a different past, but whether we have the patience to keep history open rather than rushing to close it into straight lines that are easy to understand, but may never have fully reflected how humans actually lived on Earth. When history is viewed beyond its familiar straight lines, a question almost impossible to avoid begins to surface. It is not invited, not encouraged, and often quietly sidestepped. Yet each time data refuses to align, each time familiar models begin to crack, the question returns. Not loudly, not insistently. Could there have been elements woven into the formation of human history that lie beyond what we are currently able to describe? One point needs to be made clear from the outset. This question does not require the familiar imagery of popular culture. It does not need sensational scenarios or symbols that invite misunderstanding. In fact, it is precisely the association with such imagery that has pushed this question out of serious academic space. If that outer layer is set aside, what remains is not a specific hypothesis, but a recurring pattern in the history of scientific thought and human psychology. Whenever humans encounter data that exceeds their current capacity to explain it, a gap appears. That gap is not only a lack of information, but a lack of an interpretive framework. And within that gap, the human mind tends to reach for causes that lie outside familiar systems, not because they are correct, but because they temporarily soothe the discomfort created by inconsistency in the data. The history of science has witnessed this reflex many times. When the motion of celestial bodies was not yet understood, intention was attributed to them. When disease lacked a biological mechanism, its causes were sought beyond the human body, not from a lack of reason, but from a lack of tools. As tools and methods emerged, those explanations gradually withdrew, not because they were forbidden, but because they were no longer necessary. What is notable in contemporary debates is that questions about out-of-frame factors tend to arise not where data is scarce, but where data is abundant, yet incompatible. When timelines overlap, when techniques do not match their context, when patterns repeat across regions with no direct connection, the human mind instinctively looks beyond the system to explain the inconsistency. It is here that a boundary must be carefully maintained. Asking a question is not the same as asserting an answer. Acknowledging that current models are insufficient does not oblige us to adopt a different, untested model. Properly understood, out-of-frame elements are not explanations but signals. Signals that something in how we understand humans, environments, or time itself remains incomplete. In many cases, as data accumulates and methods improve, the question naturally narrows. What once seemed impossible becomes not yet understood. What was once framed as beyond human capacity turns out to be the result of underestimating the flexibility and diversity of human interaction with the world. Archaeological history is full of such moments where patience replaced early speculation with explanations that were simpler but far more profound. For this reason, questions about factors beyond the current frame should neither be ridiculed nor elevated. They must be kept in their proper place, as warning lights. When they appear repeatedly, it is not because evidence for an external agent has emerged, but because we are pressing against the limits of our present understanding. And rather than leaping across those limits through belief, science chooses to expand them gradually through data, verification, and humility in the face of what it does not yet know. That humility is the key. It allows us to say, we do not yet know the whole story, not because something has been hidden, but because human history is more complex than the tidy patterns we are accustomed to using. And within that complexity, asking questions, even uncomfortable ones, is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of a science that is still alive. From here, the line of thought does not continue by searching for causes beyond humanity, but by returning to human history itself. When data does not align, the first thing to re-examine is not the intervention of someone else, but what of our own past has been overlooked. Chapters never written, people never recorded, and paths of development that dissolved before they could become dominant. It is within those gaps that a simpler, yet more difficult, explanation may be waiting to be faced directly. Each time uncomfortable questions are raised about discontinuous data, fractured histories, or forgotten memory, another force appears alongside science, the media. Not as an adversary, but as a powerful filtering system that decides what is seen, what is skimmed past, and what ultimately settles into collective memory as ancient truth. At this intersection, the past is not only discovered, but selected, framed, and retold. In the modern world, a discovery no longer needs only to be correct. It needs to fit the rhythm of visibility. It needs images that are clear enough, a story that is short enough, and an emotional hook strong enough to cut through the dense flow of information. Findings that meet these criteria, even when the data is still preliminary, can quickly become phenomena. A faint structure beneath ice becomes a city. A geological anomaly is retold as hidden proof, not because someone is deliberately distorting the facts, but because systems of information distribution favor what is easy to tell over what takes time to understand. By contrast, some discoveries carry great scientific value but do not fit this format. They lack striking visuals, lack dramatic payoff, or require multiple layers of context to avoid being misunderstood. These findings live on in technical papers, specialist conferences, and debates that stretch on for years, not because they are less important, but because they are incompatible with the tempo of mass media, and in that incompatibility, they slowly slip from public awareness, even if they have never been disproven. Algorithms deepen this gap. They do not assess the reliability of data, nor do they distinguish between hypothesis and conclusion. Their only metric is attention. When a shocking story spreads widely, it builds momentum. Similar stories are pushed forward. Cautious content, filled with conditions, uncertainty, or unresolved questions, is gradually pushed aside. There is no conspiracy here, only optimization. A cold process that cares nothing for truth or error, only for reach. The result is a subtle illusion. The public easily comes to believe that the most frequently mentioned discoveries are also the most important ones. In reality, attention is not a measure of scientific value. One phenomenon may rise because it touches the curiosities, fears, or hopes of the moment. Another may remain quiet because it demands time, patience, and acceptance that answers are not yet ready. In archaeology, this imbalance is especially visible. Stories of hidden history spread far more easily than stories about methodology, margins of error, and probability. Not because audiences lack the ability to understand, but because media systems rarely reward uncertainty. A finding presented as a possibility is always less compelling than one told as a certainty, even when that certainty is fragile. Over time, this creates a fragmentation in how the past is perceived. Some discoveries are amplified until they become symbols, even though debate remains unresolved. Others disappear almost entirely, even if they may matter more for understanding long-term history. Gradually, the boundary between what is known and what is talked about drifts farther apart. This does not make science meaningless, but it does make the path to it more difficult. To engage seriously with the past, an observer must question not only the data, but also how that data is narrated. Why does this discovery appear everywhere? Why is that one barely mentioned at all? The answer rarely lies fully within the discovery itself. It lies at the intersection of science, media, and what an era is prepared to absorb. It is at this intersection that a new kind of attentiveness becomes necessary. Not to dismiss every compelling story, but to maintain just enough distance, to recognize that ancient truth does not move according to algorithms, it does not respond to trends, nor reshape itself to meet our expectations. It reveals itself unevenly in fragments, and often in places that attract the least attention. From here, the line of thought slowly pulls away from the urgency of media cycles and returns to a longer timescale. There, discoveries do not need to become phenomena in order to matter. Truth is not measured by how widely it spreads, but by what remains after attention fades. And it is in that quiet space that another question begins to take shape. When the media moves on, when algorithms turn elsewhere, what will remain and what will vanish along with the short-lived waves of modern curiosity? As the waves of attention gradually recede, the year 2025 takes on a different shape. not as a year that delivered definitive answers, but as a moment of data accumulation. A year in which archaeology, geology, climate science, and observational technologies simultaneously opened up new surfaces of inquiry, more than we are able to interpret immediately. In that context, the value lies not in closing questions quickly, but in allowing them to remain unfinished long enough to be understood properly. What has been established, viewed cautiously, is far from insignificant. Melting ice is exposing spaces that were sealed off for long stretches of time. Forests, deserts, and the seafloor are revealing traces of human intervention more subtle and widespread than previously assumed. Ancient humans were not merely passive responders to their environments. They actively organized, observed, and remembered the world around them in diverse ways. These are no longer speculative claims. They are supported by data, even if that data remains fragmented. Alongside this stands a longer list of what cannot yet be confirmed. Dating at many sites still spans wide margins. Measurement methods require repetition and cross-checking. Many discoveries lack sufficient cultural context to interpret their functional meaning. There are structures that cannot yet be named, objects that resist placement within familiar developmental sequences, and patterns that have not appeared consistently enough to distinguish rule from coincidence. It is precisely the space between these two zones, between what has grounding and what cannot yet be concluded, that 2025 truly occupies. This is not a gap born of ignorance, but one of deliberate waiting, a state in which postponing conclusions does not stem from hesitation, but from acknowledging that the questions are more complex than our existing explanatory frameworks can accommodate. In this state, discoveries are no longer forced to serve a single overarching narrative. They are allowed to exist as independent data points not yet fully connected. This can be uncomfortable for those accustomed to speed and clear conclusions, but on the scale of deep time, it signals a form of science stable enough not to mask uncertainty with premature certainty. For that reason, 2025 does not feel like a moment that closes anything. It feels like an opening. Multiple lines of research were set in motion at once. Some will lead to clearer answers in the near future. Others may stall or branch in unexpected directions. And some may never yield a concrete conclusion, yet quietly alter how questions themselves are asked. What stands out most from this distance is not what 2025 proved, but what it allowed. It allowed data to move ahead of narrative. It allowed history to be non-linear. It allowed gaps to remain open without being hastily filled. In a culture accustomed to rapid certainty, this represents a meaningful adjustment. Seen from the future, 2025 may not be remembered as the year of a decisive discovery. It is more likely to be remembered as the year science allowed itself to pause, not to stop, but to look more carefully at the distance between what was already known and what was still, slowly and persistently, coming into view. In that suspended state, 2025 closed without delivering a verdict, no confirmation, no denial. And 2026 opened not as a promise, but as a continuation of reality. The Earth is still in motion, whether science is ready or not, whether history has had time to adjust or not. What has begun to surface will not stop, not because humans understand it and not because they remain uncertain. Ice continues to melt not according to the rhythm of research, but according to the rhythm of climate. Each melt season does more than reshape terrain. It exposes surfaces that were long isolated from observational history. Most of them will be nothing more than soil and stone, but among them will be incomplete signals, structures that resist naming, material layers that do not fit older assumptions, traces clear enough to be noticed, yet not clear enough to explain. Forests continue to open as well, not as a metaphor, but in the very literal archaeological sense. remote sensing technologies steadily peel back layers of canopy, revealing geometries that were hidden for centuries. Not cities, not empires, but signs of arrangement. Spaces once shaped by human hands and later reclaimed by nature. Each time this happens, the idea of a truly untouched wilderness is forced to shift a little further. The oceans, in a quieter but equally consequential way, are changing too. Fluctuations in sea level, uneven as they are, still expose ancient shorelines and structures that once lay beyond observation. What was previously dismissed as noise or mere geological curiosity may be revisited with better instruments and denser data. Not to hunt for sensational stories, but to understand how humans once lived in spaces that have since slipped off the map. For this reason, 2026 does not open as a year of conclusive discovery. It opens as a phase of continuation, one in which data keeps accumulating while the story does not. Unresolved questions will persist alongside new findings, and a familiar feeling in modern science becomes more pronounced, that the past is broader than we once imagined, but also more fragmented, harder to grasp, and less willing to satisfy our desire for clarity. What matters is not what 2026 will bring, but how we enter it, not with the expectation of uncovering a grand secret, but with readiness for small, scattered discoveries that may sometimes disappoint. Because history does not surface according to the logic of storytelling, it surfaces according to the logic of nature, when ice grows thin enough, when forests open just enough, when water retreats far enough. Perhaps the most notable aspect of 2026 will not lie in what is found, but in the attitude that accompanies those findings. If 2025 was the year data began to appear, then 2026 may be the year humans are forced to practice something more difficult: patience. Patience to resist retelling the past through familiar frames, patience to accept that many things will remain unresolved, and patience to recognize that each new discovery does not necessarily answer old questions. Sometimes it simply shows that those questions themselves need to be asked again from the beginning. As data continues to surface without yet being arranged into familiar frameworks, a very human reflex often emerges: the feeling that history itself is becoming unstable, not because what we know has been proven wrong, but because what once felt sufficient no longer is. This discomfort is often expressed as anxiety about history collapsing, even though what is actually happening is not collapse, but an expansion of perspective. History rarely operates as a closed system of final conclusions. It is an accumulative process in which each generation approaches the same past with different tools, different questions, and different limits. New discoveries do not erase old milestones. They simply reveal that those milestones were once placed within a narrower context than the one we now inhabit. Agriculture remains a major transformation. Urbanization still marks a turning point in social organization. Writing continues to be a powerful means of preserving knowledge. But as data expands, these elements no longer stand on an empty plane. They are surrounded by more flexible, harder to classify phases, ways of living that did not lead to states, did not accumulate centralized power, and did not leave enduring architecture. Recognizing these layers does not weaken the historical narrative. It places it within a more realistic frame. From a distance, history always appears tidy. Clear chains of cause and effect. Sharp temporal markers. But as we move closer, that neatness begins to dissolve. Milestones become overlapping zones. Developmental paths branch, converge, and then vanish. This is not a sign of chaos, but a sign that observation has become detailed enough to no longer conceal complexities that were always there. The fear that acknowledging anomalies will destabilize history often stems from a desire for control. A clear past makes the present feel more secure. But that security is, in part, the result of simplification. The past never truly operated along straight, easily told lines. It was presented that way so it could be taught, transmitted, and remembered. Expanding history does not mean making everything vague. On the contrary, it allows a clearer distinction between what has been firmly established and what still lies at the edge of understanding. When the historical frame is wide enough, new data no longer needs to serve a single grand conclusion. It is allowed to exist as incomplete information, requiring more time, more context, and sometimes another generation of research. Perhaps the most significant change lies not in the discoveries themselves, but in how we learn to read history. Instead of searching for a closed narrative, history begins to resemble a map still being drawn. Some regions are clearly defined, others are only sketched, and there are still blank spaces left intentionally. Not because data is absent, but because the data does not yet allow an honest rendering. History does not collapse when it is examined more deeply. It only loses the illusion of completeness, and in that loss another possibility opens, to see the past not as a final verdict, but as an ongoing process, one in which revisiting questions is not a sign of failure, but a necessary condition for understanding to continue moving forward. The difficulty does not lie in the possibility that the past may be more complex than we were taught. The past itself is not altered by being revisited or reinterpreted. The real challenge is that we have grown accustomed to operating with a model simple enough to be usable, to the point that we gradually confuse the convenience of the model with how accurately it reflects reality. That model is so familiar it has become almost invisible, a continuous line of development from simple to complex, from survival to organization, from dispersion to concentration. This is not a false story, but it is a compressed one. It was designed to be easy to transmit, easy to teach, and easy to remember, not to encompass the full history of a species that has existed through hundreds of thousands of years of environmental and social change. That compression serves a purpose. It allows knowledge to move efficiently. But the cost is that anything which does not fit the model is easily treated as an exception, as noise, or as insufficiently important to integrate. When new data appears, the common reflex is not to deny its reality, but to try to force it back into the familiar frame, or to set it aside if that proves impossible. This does not arise from closed-mindedness, but from a deeply human cognitive need, the need for completeness. A history that feels settled gives the present a sense of footing. It creates the impression that the big questions have already been answered, and that what remains are merely details to be filled in. When new discoveries suggest that the past may not have been so seamless, that it contained branches of development which led nowhere familiar, they do not break history itself. They break the feeling that history has already been finished. On a broader level, this reshapes how we locate ourselves in time. If history is a straight line leading to us, then our position feels inevitable. But if history is more like a network of possibilities, where many paths once existed and then disappeared, then the present is simply one configuration that remained, not a necessary destination, and not the only outcome that could have occurred. This perspective does not diminish the value of modern society, but it does require letting go of an unspoken assumption that what exists today is the optimal measure of what once existed. When that assumption is withdrawn, anomalies from the past no longer need to be treated as threats. They become indicators, signs that history once operated with far more options than our current models allow for. Faint traces, techniques that left no long developmental sequence, or structures that resist classification are not necessarily evidence of absence or failure. They may reflect paths of development that did not prioritize long-term material durability or that did not persist long enough to survive major disruptions. Their incompatibility with familiar narratives says more about the limits of those narratives than it does about the value of the traces themselves. The greatest challenge posed by recent discoveries, then, is not the need to rewrite history in a new direction. It is the need to accept that history may never reach a state of being finished. Rather than a closed account, history begins to appear as a space gradually being filled, with clearly defined regions, blurred zones, and blank areas deliberately left open. Within that space, what is required is not a complete replacement model, but the ability to tolerate incompleteness, the ability to continue asking questions without demanding final answers, and the ability to accept that understanding the past is not a search for absolute certainty, but a process of learning to live with an ever more visible complexity in the story of human existence itself. After all the data, the debates, and the gaps that cannot yet be filled, what remains is not a conclusion. What remains is a pause, a necessary pause, one that allows us to recognize the limits of what can honestly be said at this moment, not because the past refuses to answer, but because the questions being asked have moved beyond the pace we are used to handling. The past does not operate according to the demands of the present. It does not need to be clear, nor does it need to justify itself. It exists only as incomplete traces, and our task is not to force those traces into answers, but to learn how to approach them more slowly. Much of the unease surrounding recent discoveries does not come from the data itself, but from the tempo of the present. We are accustomed to everything being quickly classified, true or false, verified or rejected. But history does not function according to that binary logic. It rarely allows definitive conclusions, especially when we are standing at the boundary between what is known and what cannot yet be confirmed. When ice melts, forests open, and seas retreat, there is no past returning. There are only spaces that were once outside observation becoming visible. Most of what emerges carries no special meaning, but some traces, faint, fragmented, difficult to name, compels science to acknowledge them, even when they cannot yet be placed into a complete narrative. They do not demand new belief. They only ask for caution before old assumptions are closed. History, in this sense, is not a finished record. It is an ongoing dialogue between what remains and the questions the present brings to it. Each generation can access only part of that dialogue with its own tools, models, and limitations. What remains unexplained is not a failure, but the condition that allows the dialogue to continue. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said at this moment is this: we do not yet know enough. And within that not knowing there is no lack, but space. Space to acknowledge that the past may be broader than the frameworks we are currently using. Space to accept that humans once existed in more ways than history has grown accustomed to recording. And space to understand that knowledge is not a final destination, but a slow accumulation, one that repeatedly has to revise the very questions it asks. So rather than closing this story with a definitive conclusion, it is more fitting to stop in an open state, where there are no grand declarations, only clarity about what cannot yet be fully said. History does not ask us to complete it. It only asks that we not rush to declare it complete. And in that pause, when the urge to explain briefly quiets, a simple realization comes into view. It is not the past that is waiting to be decoded. It is us who are learning how to ask better questions. The dialogue continues, not through final answers, but through the patience to look again, more slowly, more deeply, and with less certainty than before.